Dear listeners, welcome to another episode of Oliver the Time Traveler. Oliver and Isabella spent the night at the inn in Hollowbrook in the year 2901. Along with Edward, they planned to travel to California in the year 1871 to search for the next watcher. Edward made a quick trip back to his home in the year 2713 to collect some final items before they all depart for California. But let's not delay any longer. Let's continue with the story. It's early in the morning, and Isabella stands by the window in the inn, gazing outside at the rising sun that bathes Hollowbrook in a golden light. The grass in front of the inn glistens with fresh green, and the chirping of birds can be heard through the windows. Oliver, still under a blanket, opens his eyes and looks at Isabella, saying, "Good morning, Isabella. You're up early." Isabella turns around, smiles, and says, "Not only did I sleep well, but I find this place beautiful. I've never heard of Hollowbrook before, but I feel very comfortable here. I could live here." Oliver chuckles and says, "Yes, but we'd need to spruce up the place a bit because the whole town is in ruins." But indeed, Isabella, Hollowbrook is a lovely little town. It's just a shame that so much has changed over the centuries. However, the grass is still as green as when I lived here, and everything feels livelier. Isabella laughs too and says, "There's food and some drinks on the table. If you'd like to get out of bed, we can check if Edward is somewhere around here. I'm really curious. It's truly remarkable that he managed to replicate the watch and can travel anywhere." Oliver says, "Indeed. It's incredible that he pulled it off. He's also the one who warned me to be careful with my belongings. So, I trust him to some extent. I'm really looking forward to seeing if he shows up in front of the inn, so we can leave somewhat on time." He chuckles at his own remark as he's still lying on a bench under a blanket. Oliver gets out of bed and opens the back door of the inn. He takes off his shirt and, to Isabella's surprise, takes a running start and jumps with a laugh into the stream behind the inn. After a few dives, he emerges from the water, and Isabella says, "It might be a bit chilly, but quite refreshing." Laughing, he walks back into the inn, wet from the water, and sits at the table to enjoy a cup of tea and a leftover Martian sandwich. With his mouth full, Oliver says, "If we ever decide to live here, a real Martian dinner comp is definitely an idea. We should seriously consider that, Isabella." Isabella chuckles and says, "Do you always do that? I mean, there's a bathroom here in the inn, I've discovered." Laughing, Oliver says, "I'm quite fond of the stream behind the inn. But yes, indeed, the inn has a bathroom, which I would certainly upgrade. The bathroom on Mars wasn't too shabby. We could easily make it here, or maybe we can get a bathroom from Yuri and Stellara in the year 4361. Who knows, maybe they have something on offer on Mars." Oliver and Isabella both laugh because it sounds so strange but might actually be possible. By now, Oliver has dried off, and the last Martian sandwiches have been devoured. After they've cleared the plates and cups, Oliver looks at Isabella and asks, "Are you ready?" Isabella nods and says, "Yes, Oliver, everything is tidied up and neat again. Let's go outside and see if we might spot Edward coming. I'm very curious. Traveling together with all three of us for the first time is quite special, and I'm also genuinely interested in who we'll encounter there in 1871. Oliver nods, puts his bag over his shoulder, and takes Isabella's hand, saying, "Come on, let's go outside." Together, they leave the inn, and Isabella closes the door behind them. Isabella and Oliver walk along the sunlit path towards the wide street. Oliver looks at Isabella and says, "We didn't agree on a specific time with Edward. He mentioned he'd be back in the morning. I'm curious, shall we walk a little way down the street?" Isabella says, "That sounds like a good idea, Oliver. I'd like to take a brief stroll through Hollowbrook before we head to California." Together, Oliver and Isabella walk down the street in the direction of the square where the library is located. Despite many buildings being in disrepair and the streets appearing deserted, the sun creates a peaceful ambience in Hollowbrook. It's as though Hollowbrook itself has taken a moment to catch its breath and is ready for a new chapter in time. Once they reach the round square, Isabella says to Oliver, "Let's sit on that bench in the sun. We can still see the inn from there, and we'll naturally notice if Edward manages to return here." Oliver nods, and they sit down on the bench. Isabella closes her eyes, turns her head toward the sun, and says, "It's lovely here, Oliver. If we were to live here, we should start a bakery with a tea garden." Oliver chuckles and says, "That's actually a pretty good idea. With Martian sandwiches and Greek cheese rolls from Nikos. With a dinner comp, it would make things even easier for us." Oliver is about to say something else but remains silent, smiling as he looks towards the end of the street in the direction of the inn. He raises his hand and calls out, "Edward! This way!" Edward, who is standing at the end of the street, turns around, waves back, and begins walking toward Oliver and Isabella. Upon reaching them, Edward gives a slight bow and then says, "Good morning this morning. How did you sleep, and are you ready? I'm glad I arrived in time because I narrowly missed landing in the stream behind the inn. I need to make some improvements to my watch so I can set it more precisely. But how are you both this morning?" Oliver and Isabella laugh at the fact that Edward was nearly placed in the stream by his watch. Oliver says, "Everything is fine and calm here, Edward. We slept well, and I must admit, I took a dip in that stream this morning, but that was intentional to freshen up. Isabella and I had breakfast, and then we walked down the street to wait for you." Isabella says, "We're glad to have you back, Edward. I've been thinking about the time we're heading to, and it could be quite dangerous. We're going to the gold rush era, where many people are frantically searching for gold. But we'll experience it. I'm very curious. And you, Edward, are you ready?" Edward nods and says, "Oh yes, don't worry about me. The only piece of advice I'd like to give you is to stick together so you can always press the red button on the watch to escape from wherever you are. Again, don't worry about me, I have my own watch. If the ground gets too hot beneath my feet, I can quickly move somewhere else with a press of the button on my watch. Stay vigilant and it should work out just fine. I'm also really curious about who we'll encounter there and how that person ended up in that time. But, what do you think, shall we go?" Oliver looks at Isabella and asks, "Are you ready?" Isabella nods, stands up, and says, "Off to the year 1871 in California." Edward says, "Absolutely. Last night, I set the time and location in my watch. I think we should all meet there, just like we're gathered here now. Hopefully, we'll be placed in a somewhat good spot." Oliver nods and says, "Indeed, that's what we hope for, Edward." Oliver reaches out his hand to Isabella, who takes it, and she says to Edward, "See you soon, Edward. Hopefully, everything goes well." With her free hand, Isabella presses the green glowing button on the watch that Oliver has on his wrist. Simultaneously, Edward presses a button on his watch hanging around his neck. Isabella and Oliver are once again surrounded by the familiar white light, and as their surroundings blur, it feels as though they are being lifted and gently placed somewhere else. When the white lights have disappeared, Oliver and Isabella find themselves in a sunlit street where horses and wagons are bustling about, and many people are walking along the street. There are no stones or asphalt on the road, it's a dusty street with wooden buildings on both sides. Oliver looks around, and Isabella tugs at his sleeve, saying excitedly, "Look, Oliver, there's Edward." Oliver looks in the direction Isabella is pointing and sees Edward standing there, wearing different clothing than when they left Hollowbrook. Edward signals for them to come his way. Oliver takes Isabella's hand again, and together they walk past the various people shaping the street scene. Women wear dresses, and some wear hats, while most men sport cowboy hats. No one pays attention to Oliver and Isabella, and they quickly reach Edward, who is grinning from ear to ear. Edward says, "I'm incredibly happy to see you both. I'm not exactly sure what's going on with my watch, but I left Hollowbrook about a second after you, and I've been here since yesterday. Is that strange or what? Anyway, as you can see, you stand out a bit with the clothing you're wearing, so let's head to the clothing store where I went right away yesterday. Don't worry about money because I have some gold coins and old dollars that I fetched from home." Isabella laughs and says admiringly, "It was clever of you to think of that, Edward." Edward says, "Come this way, there's a store with the right clothes for you over here." Oliver and Isabella follow Edward, who confidently walks towards one of the wooden buildings. Edward pushes open the wooden door, and a bell rings. Oliver and Isabella need a moment for their eyes to adjust to the store since it's not very well lit, and the bright sun shines outside. A man emerges from the back of the store and looks at Edward, saying, "Good afternoon, you again. What can I do for you?" As the storekeeper gazes from Edward to Oliver and Isabella, his jaw drops in astonishment and he exclaims, "I've never seen this before." Dear listeners, here we leave Oliver, Isabella, and Edward in a shop in a village in California in the year 1871. The three of them still have to figure out who the next watcher is and where they can be found. Please like and subscribe to not miss any of the thrilling developments in the next episode of this story. Thank you for listening, and until next time.